So I've read a lot in my life, but the thing is that I'm a very picky reader. So going through the books that I've given 5 out of 5 stars to seems like a huge feat for one video. But actually I'm such a picky reader. There's only 18 books, and so here are the 18 books that I've given a 5 out of 5 stars to in order of when I read them. Firstly, the books I read before I got a Goodreads, and I got a Goodreads about 9 years ago now. I read these books all between the age of like 5 and 12. Like, they're the books that were my favorite growing up. So firstly, 3 books from Roald Dahl, and I don't think I can say Roald Dahl correct. The Witches is probably my favorite out of the 3 books that I rated a 5 out of 5 stars. The Witches literally scarred me as a child, and those, as you will see, are the books that I love most. Like, wake me up into like the nightmare that really is life and stuff like that. A special drawing that I have a fond memory of. I'm sitting in my lounge room in front of the heater on the floor reading this book. I turn the page and I literally throw my book across the room, and I am scarred because this was so scary as a child. But I do love this book. The other 2 books that I really like from Roald Dahl, Matilda, great book, and Danny, the Champion of the World. I don't really remember anything about this. I just remember I loved it. This might be a book that I have to go back to and reread, especially once I have kids. Like, these books are coming out when I have a kid. Another series that I absolutely loved, and most children love, is Harry Potter. For some reason, I didn't understand that the Harry Potter books went in a certain order when I was younger, and they were just sort of lying around the house, so I would just pick them up whenever they were around and like read them and then be like, that was a good book. So I read the 3rd and the 4th one only as a kid. Like, I understand how I understood what was happening. Anyway, so the 4th one is my favorite Harry Potter book, and then the 3rd one is my 2nd favorite Harry Potter book. The 4th one and the 3rd one, I read these books religiously as a kid. I read them like 20 to 30 times over throughout my childhood. I eventually read the 1st, 2nd, and 6th one, and then in 2007 when the 7th one came out, I read it when it first came out. And so the 7th one is actually also a 5 out of 5 for me. The 3rd, 4th, and 7th are all 5s. I read the 5th one at the start of last year, so I never got around to the 5th one as a child for some reason. I just skipped it. Alice in Wonderland was the first classic that I loved as a child. It's very easy to read. Definitely started my love for classics. I did try to read through The Looking Glass, but I never got through the whole thing. I didn't find it as interesting, just because I fell in love with the first one so much. I never felt like I needed to go to the 2nd one. Why am I whispering? So now we finally get into books that are on my Goodreads, so I know the definite years and ages that I read them at, and these will be in proper order now. The first book on my Goodreads that I gave a 5 out of 5 to was A Thousand Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini. I read this book in year 8. It made such a profound impact upon me in realizing like how deep and heartbreaking reading can be for me. It also just opened my world up to like Afghanistan and like different countries. I had never been overseas. I had never experienced a different culture. So this is pretty much like one of the first times I had experienced something other than Australian culture. Sticking with year 8, another book that I read following this train of like reading books that were heartbreaking and from another country, experiencing a new culture, I read The Diary of a Young Girl, Anne Frank, and this was my first taste of like World War II and understanding what the Holocaust is. I think this book should just be read by everyone and anyone. If you read, you should read this. We then hit year 9, the start of year 9. Oh my god, everyone and their mother is walking around outside my door right now. So then we get to my favorite book of all time that I read at the start of year 9, Frankenstein. I talk about this book so damn much throughout my entire life. I feel like I'm sick of me talking about it at this point. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, my favorite book of all time. I will give you the quick rundown of why I love this book so much. It's heartbreaking. It's a classic. It's gothic. It's super depressing. The thing with this book is that I found it really slow when I read it. I actually didn't find it to be the perfect read. In the middle it gets quite slow for me, but at the end, the payoff was just the best thing I'd ever felt in my entire life. I'm sitting there reading this book and I am just like eating up the passages from the last like third of this book just on a silver platter. When you're in like teen depression and you hate everything and you've got this book in your hand and you're like, wow, I've never related to something more in my entire life. Is this going to be your favorite book of all time? Because it just impacts you the most out of anything you've ever read. And I have never reread it. In a way, I don't want to ruin this book for me. Like, I don't want to reread it and then be like, oh, it doesn't hit me the same, because that doesn't mean it's not my favorite book still. It just like means that the best reading experience I've ever had was when I read this at the age of 13 or 14 or whatever it was. Because I feel like reading is an experience. It's not a book. It's how the book impacts you at that time when you do read it. I had the hugest reading high when I was around 13. I read A Thousand Splendid Suns, I read Frankenstein, and then I read another book that completely impacted me to no end. This book is freaking amazing. It's also in my top 5 books, and Ariel Bissett would be very proud. Animal Farm. I love Animal Farm like there's no tomorrow. The last page completely blew my mind. I was like, wow. I want to read the line that I always bring up. Mute me if you want, but I gotta read this line out to you. 12 voices were shouting in anger, and they were all alike. No question now what had happened to the faces of the pigs. The creatures outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again, but already it was impossible to say which was which. And I literally threw this book across the room and I was like, bitch! I was like, are you kidding me? It's just amazing, man. If you read this book and you read that last paragraph, it just like blows your mind. At least it blew mine. And the next book that is a 5 out of 5 star read for me is The Beach by Alex Garland. This book is also in my top 5 books of all time. So you can take these 3 books in my top 5 and throw this one into the mix as well. And this is my top 4. I then got into my teen years where I sort of discovered YA, and I stopped reading the classics and started reading a bit more overhyped books. But also this book at the time gave me a 5 out of 5 experience. I don't know if I would give it a 5 out of 5 now rereading it, but I loved The Hunger Games Catching Fire. I read all 3 of these books and devoured them at the time. Pretty much all I can say about this book. Everyone's read it at this point, so you know what I mean. Back to some of my favorite classics. We have A Clockwork Orange. Absolutely insane is the best way I can put it. The amount of like ultra violence and rape really like threw me off at the beginning, but then as you read on, it's sort of like Lolita, you know, like it's throwing a lot of themes at you that you usually cannot like take very well because you're not used to taking them in a lot of books you read. But you realize that the author is throwing these themes at you for a reason, and it's to get a certain point across that a lot of literature doesn't usually get across. I really appreciated how unique this book was for me, of the themes it was bringing up. I then read my favorite romance I've ever read, which is The Great Gatsby. Everyone has read this as well, I feel like. But yeah, there's just this, you can see I tagged it at the time that I read it. I tagged a lot of it because there was just certain quotes in this book that I was just like, that is so beautiful. I'm not usually into romance, and I liked this book, but also I'm very into classics. And then I think if I was to put a 5th book in my top 5 along with those other 4 books, this would be the one. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey. Just loved the main character of McMurphy a lot. I thought he was brilliant, and I don't remember her name, but his push and pull with the nurse, the head nurse, like a lot of hallucinations. I'm not exactly sure why. I just remember there's a lot of hallucination scenes, and the ending's just brilliant. Important thing to note is that this book I read when I was 17. I am now 22, so I read this back in 2014, and I then went through a huge dry spell of not liking books enough to give them 5 out of 5 for about 4 years, and it wasn't until about 2018, last year, I found 2 books that I absolutely adored and gave me the love for a book enough to give it a 5 out of 5 again, which was an amazing find for me because I thought maybe I was just like growing a bit dead inside or something. And those 2 books are The Ocean at the End of the Lane and Coraline. I absolutely loved the movie Coraline, and then eventually got to the book and I devoured the book, and I was like, if I read this as a kid, this would have been shaping for me as a human being, I think. And then also An Ocean at the End of the Lane is absolutely beautiful. The world that Neil Gaiman creates with these books is just encapturing, I find. And Neil Gaiman has become one of my favorite authors of all time as well, and I want to get definitely to more of his books. So that is the 18 books that I have given a 5 out of 5 stars to in my lifetime up until this point. Always when it gets to this part of the video, I don't really know what to do, so... Like, people usually say follow my socials, but please don't follow my socials, I guess.